book out there. The co-authors Mark Halpern and John Heilman. John Heilman, how are you, sir?
I'm good, sir. How are you?
I'm good. Now, you know this isn't MSLSD, right? Just want to make sure you know that.
I'm fully aware of where I am.
Okay. You know, there are a couple things that intrigue me about this.
Okay. Let's go.
John Huntsman is one of them.
Okay.
John Huntsman was like not even an...
fellow.
Well, he was not even an also-ran, but it looks like they stirred up a lot of you-know-what. What did they do?
Well, stirred up a lot of. You mean in terms of some of the negative campaigning that they?
In terms of Herman Cain and Mitch Daniels and so forth.
Sure. Well, you know, the funny thing about John Huntsman, right, was that he, you know, ran as kind of clean hands candidate. You know, he was the guy who was. He's portrayed himself as being kind of like the reason that he didn't succeed in the Republican nomination fight was because he was kind of above the hurly-burly, right? He was kind of too principled in some way to pander to conservatives, you know, and he was trying to run as this kind of an honorable civil campaign. But he had a team of really high-end hired guns who worked for him. And, you know, even before he came back from Beijing, they had started to do some of the more grubby things that campaigns sometimes do. So one of the things they had done was, on his behalf, he didn't even know they'd done this, but they had leaked to the conservative press that he had written this letter before he took off to China calling Barack Obama a remarkable leader. Now, a lot of people thought that letter must have come from the White House, but in fact it was from Huntsman's own campaign. They wanted to try to take the wind out of the sails of what they thought would be an attack from the right because of his service to the Obama administration. So they got that out there before he came home. The other thing they did around the same time was they were the people who leaked the phone number of the woman who was the ex-wife of the man who Sherry Daniels, Mitch Daniels, the governor of Indiana, his wife had left Mitch Daniels to run off with this other fellow out in California. That guy's ex-wife was angry at Sherry Daniels, and she was wanted to peddle some dirt about Sherry Daniels, and they were sending out her phone number to reporters right around the time that Mitch Daniels was deciding whether or not to run. And the family considerations about getting dragged through the mud were a big deal to Mitch Daniels. And so,
let me slow down. You're saying...
I'm saying, go ahead.
I just want to put a fine point on this. You're saying that the Huntsman campaign leaked the phone number of the guy who Ms. Daniels had been with. It's the Huntsman campaign that did it.
It was the Huntsman campaign. It was actually of the former wife of the man who Sherry Daniels left her husband for, meaning Mitch Daniels. So Mitch Daniels in the spring of 2011 is deciding whether he wants to run for president. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of people in the Republican Party who are trying to get Mitch Daniels to run. There are a lot of good reasons for him to run, but he was held back to a large extent, as we report in the book in Double Down. He was held back by his family. His daughters didn't want him to run, and his wife was very publicity shy, and she didn't want him to run either. But he was still trying to figure out whether or not to run. And at just the moment, about the time when he was trying to really make up his mind, coming down to a final decision, a bunch of news stories appeared that dredged up some of Mitch Daniels' kind of complicated marital history. The fact that his wife had left him, moved to California for this other guy, and then split up with that guy and then come back to Mitch Daniels. This woman, Sherry Daniels, that he's married to now, she left him, married another guy, divorced that guy, and then came back to Mitch Daniels.
All right, but I want that's pretty sleazy. I mean, I honestly...
All of that's going on, and what the Huntsman campaign did was they sent out to reporters the phone number of the ex-wife of the ex-husband of Sherry Daniels, who was dying to say vindictive and nasty things about Sherry Daniels. All of it kind of in an effort to try to make the process seem like it was going to be very messy and painful to try to keep Mitch Daniels out of the race, because the Huntsman people thought Mitch Daniels.
All right, let me ask you this: was anybody sleazier in the campaign than doing something like that?
Well, it's not unknown, Mark. I think you're a realist, and you know a lot of dirty things happen in campaigns. It's not the first time I've heard of something that sleazy.
Honestly, I've never been involved in anything like this. Well, I'm much an ideal. Well, let's move on. I don't want to run out of time. Herman Cain, what about that?
Well, they were, you and your listeners will remember that Herman Cain, when he was riding high in the polls in about October of 2011, was suddenly hit with a series of stories in the press about sexual harassment charges against him when he was the head of the National Restaurant Association, and a series of women came forward. Once the first charge was leveled about having a history of sexual harassment charges against him, a series of women then came forward and made various claims. The first story about that was a story that ran in Politico, and it turns out that now that by this time John Huntsman was back in America, and he was in the race, an active candidate in the race. The source for that story, or at least one of the sources for that story, providing the opposition research to Politico that outed that first sexual harassment charge against Herman Cain, was also the Huntsman campaign.
Huntsman again?
Huntsman again. While John Huntsman was running on the surface the Clean Hands campaign, it turns out that his campaign staff was very adept at funneling dirt to the media on his rivals.
Do we know who on the staff?
Well, I do, but we don't.
You're not allowed to say.
We don't report that in the book.
And what about Huntsman trying to take down Romney?
Well, Huntsman was their great history of the Huntsman clan and the Romney clan. They're both kind of epic families in the history of Mormonism, and there's a long, tangled history. The families were once very close, but John Huntsman Jr. and Mitt Romney had a series of fallings out over the course of the years. First over who was going to run the Salt Lake City, who was going to rescue the Salt Lake City Olympics. Then in 2008, over John Huntsman's endorsement, he had promised that he would endorse Mitt Romney, and then suddenly spurned Mitt Romney and went and became John McCain's national co-chair, and that seeded a lot of bad blood between the families. So there was a deep-seated kind of like feud between these families. Huntsman hated Romney. Romney hated Huntsman. In both sides, there was no other candidate who got under the skin of John Huntsman more than Mitt Romney, or of Mitt Romney more than John Huntsman. But Huntsman, though he had these deep feelings about Romney, his campaign could never get him to take Romney on in the debates or in any other public way, which is what they needed him to do to try to knock Romney down a peg and give Huntsman a little bit of room to breathe.
Now, do you guys know who gave Harry Reid information supposedly about Romney and his taxes, or not?
Well, there we come back to the Huntsman family again, and we report in the book that Harry Reid's source. Now, you may remember this when Harry Reid went around all last summer, the summer of 2012, saying that Romney had not paid any taxes for 10 years. He said that he had a source. And he had a good source. He had a credible source. He wouldn't say who that source was. There was a lot of speculation at the time in the press that source was John Huntsman Sr., Huntsman's father, who's a billionaire and a great industrialist out in Utah. Huntsman Sr. denied that story in the press at the time, but it turns out, according to our reporting, that in fact Harry Reid told many people, including people in the Obama White House, that his source was in fact John Huntsman Sr.
And Reid's a Mormon, too, so they kind of travel in similar circles, I take it, right?
They do. John Huntsman Sr. has a very diverse group of friends, everyone from Harry Reid's one of his friends, and everyone as far left as Harry Reid and as far right as Glenn Beck.
Now, we have to take a break. Can you hang over?
I sure can.
So Huntsman was stirring up quite a bit, wasn't he?
He stirred up an awful lot of trouble, one way or the other, either the family or the campaign.
The book is Double Down, Game Change 2012. I'm talking to one of the co-authors, John Heilman. The other is Mark Halpern. We'll be right back. We've got John Heilman with us. John Heilman, we've got some interesting information here about Chris Christie. He really hasn't been vetted that much, and he obviously wants to be president. What did you learn about him?
Well, Chris Christie is certainly on his way to being reelected in New Jersey, and many people think he's, if not the front runner, a front runner for the Republican nomination in 2016. We have a lot of reporting in the book from everything from Christie's how seriously he considered actually running in 2012 to the various controversies around his speech at the Republican convention in Tampa. But the heart of the story really is the consideration Romney gave to Christie to making him his vice presidential nominee, and we go very deep into the vice presidential vetting of Christie that Romney undertook. He at first put Christie on his short list and then took him off the list because he was concerned about some controversies that were in the public record, but just not widely known to most people in national politics outside of New Jersey. I'll give you one example is the fact that, Christie for a while when he was a lobbyist, a lot of people don't even know that Christie was a lobbyist for a period of time.
I didn't know.
But he was a lobbyist, and one of the people he lobbied for when he was a lobbyist was a group called the Securities Industry Association of America. That group wanted to have financial fraud excluded from the New Jersey state consumer protection law, and Christie lobbied on behalf of that cause. At that time, the chairman of the Securities Industry Association was Bernie Madoff. So for a lot of people in Christie's vetting team, they looked at that and they said, well, that's a 30-second ad waiting to happen. Chris Christie was Bernie Madoff's lobbyist. That's not good, right? So Romney took him off the list, and then he put him back on the list because one of his advisors said, look, we're in a street fight here with the Obama people, and we need the best street brawler there is. So we got to think more seriously about Christie. So they did an 11-day crash vet of Christie to really see if they could get him on the ticket. And when they looked not only at the range of controversies that were kind of below the radar but in the public record, one of those I just mentioned, but there are others. And then they looked at, there was an Inspector General's report. The federal government had looked into Christie's excessive spending, flying around the country, staying in first-class hotels when he was a U.S. attorney. But there was a whole other set of things they asked Christie about that he was not forthcoming about. Normally, when a vice presidential candidate, someone who's being considered, agrees to be vetted, they give over all the information that the campaign wants. Christie was very withholding of information, and in the end, there were a series of things. His other lobbying clients that he was not forthcoming about, his health records, which he was not forthcoming about, his household help histories of people who he had hired to work at his home, and some details about a lawsuit that his brother was involved in with the SEC. Those four areas are listed in the final vetting report that was turned over to Mitt Romney, where the vetters basically said to Romney, look, we can't recommend this guy go forward unless all of these questions get answered. He's refused to answer these questions, and we can't really with confidence say that this is the right guy. And Romney looked at that report and said, Christie's off the list, pulled the plug right at that moment.
All right, let me ask problems. No, I don't have your book because I wanted to get you on, so I want to ask you this question.
Yeah.
Somebody obviously, and I'm not trying to punk you here because you're a reporter and you don't give up your sources, but did this come from the Romney camp, this information?
Well, look, we don't talk about our sources in this case,
but it would have to.
You can draw your own conclusions about that. It is the case. I don't believe there's ever been in campaign journalism in the past. I don't think anyone has ever quoted extensively from a final vetting report on a vice presidential, someone who's been considered.
Well, only so many people have that, right? I have to assume, as a relatively logical person, that it came from the Romney camp.
It is supposed to be a very confidential process, the vice presidential vetting, and it took a lot of work to try to get hold of that document. Like I said, I can't tell you where we got it from, but certainly. But by one means or another, it came from inside Romney world. I can't say how many other hands it passed through.
But you actually got the vetting document?
We had the document, yeah, and we quoted
the whole document.
In the book. I'm not saying we have the whole document.
All right.
But we quote from it at length and extensively in the book.
Do you?
In order to give, we reproduce large chunks of language of what the vetters' concerns were.
Well, let me ask you this
with the final date on it and everything else. Yeah.
Just because we unfortunately we get short on time.
Sure.
My question is this: you've got to wonder, you and Halpern or anybody,
yeah,
what are the motives of people who are willing to give up stuff like this? Don't you think?
Well, many people speculate about that. We like to think that our sources are all involved in the process in order to try to do a service to history.
Oh, jeez. Okay, well, I think you're sarcastic, but that's okay. Now, let me ask you this.
No, I'm just idealistic, just like you, Mark.
No. Leaking somebody's vetting report, that's not idealistic. That's not you, whoever did it. That's what we call a hit. Let me ask you this. Obama's second debate.
Yeah.
You've written about sort of panic there before the second debate. What's that all about?
Well, you will remember, and all your listeners will remember, the president had given a pretty disastrous performance at the first debate in Denver, and his supporters were panicked about all across the country. Democrats, suddenly the polls were getting tighter, and people were worried that Mitt Romney was going to be able to because it was getting suddenly tight again. After the 47% controversy and some other things that happened in September, Obama seemed to be pulling away. Denver happened, the polls got tighter. Everyone now suddenly around the president was like, well, we could afford one bad debate performance, but we can't afford to screw up the second debate because voters might forgive and forget one bad debate performance and write that off, but they won't if you look like you don't want the job and it looks like you're coasting, or it doesn't look like you're fighting for them. It doesn't look like you really want to earn this job. We got to come out fighting in the second debate. And 36 hours before that second debate at Hofstra University in New York, the president suffered an epic collapse in one of his mock debates with John Kerry, who was standing in for Mitt Romney in Williamsburg, Virginia. It was the worst performance. He had been bad in mock debates before Denver. He was bad in Denver, but this was worse than anything anyone had seen. It was so bad that David Plouffe, the president's senior advisor in the White House, said, if he does this again at Hofstra two nights from now, we could lose the whole election. That's how bad this was. And so they had to take him aside, a group of his top aides, David Plouffe, David Axelrod, his chief debate coach, Ron Klain, and sit down with him in a room and have what they called an intervention, where they sat down and said to him, what's going on with you? What is wrong? And we report at great length about this conversation in which the president sort of says, I don't really know if I can do this. I'm not wired right for this kind of thing. I hate doing debates. I think it's all theatrical. I think it's all BS. I just don't know that I can do this. What's required of me here? And all of them thought it was the most extraordinary conversation they'd ever had, because you're only a few weeks from Election Day. And normally, in a debate prep situation like that, especially with a sitting president, by that point you're talking about, well, what's the best line on this? What's the best zinger on that? You're not having an existential crisis about, is this guy, can he really do this thing? He also confessed to his team at that moment that people had been criticizing Obama for not running on very much. They didn't have much of a second-term agenda. And in this conversation with his top aides, he said, it is a problem. You guys keep telling me I should talk about the future. I don't really have that many plans for the future that we've articulated in this campaign. I'm sort of empty here. What are we going to do? And they had to basically kind of carry him across the finish line and give him a bunch of basically scripted answers to the most likely questions and have him kind of memorize those answers in a series of drill sessions, and then kind of buck him up and get him to kind of crawl, basically kind of right up to the edge and kind of push him over the finish line so that he could perform as well as he ended up doing in Hofstra on that crucial second debate.
Isn't it amazing how little the American people know when these things are going on? It's just amazing to me. So much of this is performance and drama, isn't it? It
is. And, I'll tell you, Mark, we've done this book. We did, having done Game Change 4 years ago, and this book, Mark and I both, have reported on these presidential campaigns going back now 25 years. And, we feel like when we're reporting on them in real time that we have a pretty good idea about what's going on. But then when we, finish with the election and we go and sit down for these long interviews with people, hours long, and we ask people, okay, now the election's over, tell us what was really going on. We often are kind of staggered by how much, even though we consider ourselves very well informed about what's going on, we're staggered by the things we learn, and that we feel as though, we often said, we feel like we're covering the campaign with bags over our heads because so much is concealed by the political stagecraft that everyone's now so skilled at doing, putting out a public image that's different from what's going on in private. It's always a kind of shocking and revelatory thing for us as much as it is for our readers.
Well, whatever people digest from the book or they want to accept or not accept, the fact is, just in the short 20 minutes or so, you've given us a completely different view. Well, Huntsman, I always wondered about him. But, but still, how dirty that campaign was. I'm not saying from a point of naivete, but you're right. He was out there as Mr. Clean, that Obama was choking badly before the second debate, that Christie, I didn't know all this stuff about Christie, to be quite, I'm not an investigative reporter. Right. So, and Romney had a problem with that, and he had to deal with that, and somebody leaked the vetting file, obviously, I will say, from the Romney campaign. This is all kind of scuzzy intrigue, which is why the people get disgusted with this stuff.
Well, it's certainly the case. That nothing about politics is as it seems on the surface, and in some weird way, there's a what we're trying to to kind of give people. There's public images and there's private realities, and part of what we're trying to do is always just kind of tell people what the real high human drama and what these campaigns are really like from the inside, what it's really like to go through running for president, and what the people who are involved in shaping these people and shaping the campaigns as people experience them, what the reality is as compared to what you see on TV, on the nightly news when the thing's going on.
I'll say this. Whatever your personal political views are, they really don't come out in this book. From what I'm reading here now, everybody's dealt with in one way or another. I'll tell you what, John Heilman, I want to thank you for coming on short notice. This really intrigues me. The book is Double Down, Game Change 2012. We're going to put it on social sites, Mr. Producer. All right, and good luck, my friend.
Absolutely a pleasure. Thanks a lot, Mark.
All right, you too. Take care. This is a fascinating book to me. I know it's gossipy, but that's not why. Did you know all this stuff, Mr. Producer? No way. Well, how do we know it's true? Well, you got to read these things and draw your own conclusions, but some of this certainly seems true to me, and if it's really not true, it can seriously be a case for defamation suits. So I'm guessing this stuff has been vetted legally over and over and over again by the publisher. Penguin Press. Double Down Game Change 2012.